mukhang since lumala yung epekto ng China-originated COVID-19 on the rest of the world, including dito sa Southeast Asia, China's neighbors, nag-intensify din yung Chinese public diplomacy. And interestingly, China is trying to project also itself as a friendly nation in the West Philippine Sea and the broader South China Sea. And once again, for the win, ang Chinese embassy dito sa Pilipinas pushing again an alternative narrative in a Facebook post entitled Truth or Lies. Ang sinasabi ng China dito is that the United States and its allies are sowing discords, meaning nagpapadivide sila ng mga countries dito sa region natin, sila ang nagkikreate ng tension, habang China naman is pushing for solidarity and cooperation. And on the other hand, pinapakita yung mga Chinese aircrafts providing humanitarian assistance and medical equipment to the countries in need. Parang ang bait ng China at US and its allies pa ang may kasalanan dito. Now, if you look at it, there are actually three different layers to China's narrative or alternative narrative, or some would say revisionist narrative of what's happening dyan sa West Philippine Sea and the broader South China Sea. On one hand, China always argues, and we see that also in the statement of its friends, including President Duterte, that the situation in the West Philippine Sea is generally stable. Wala naman masyadong gulo dyan. Everything is more or less fine. The second layer to Chinese alternative narrative, or some would say propaganda, is that actually yung pag-construct ng mga military bases and major infrastructure, yung mga artificial islands dyan sa may Kalayaan, dyan sa may Paracels, among others, it is actually to allow China to provide international public goods. So kung gagawa ng mga lighthouse or hospital ang China sa mga isla na yan, then they can provide assistance to those like fishermen or military personnel on naval ships na stranded at may kailangan ng assistance. And the third layer, which is very much related dito sa latest post from the Chinese embassy, is that the United States is actually the source of problems in this part of the world. That the US is the bully, that the US is the source of tensions. Well, interestingly, hindi bago yung ganitong alternative narrative. In fact, China is considered by many experts as a revisionist power. In fact, as I have discussed in two of my books, Asia's New Battlefield and the Indo-Pacific, China is more or less considered as a revisionist power. It's trying to revise yung mga existing rules, formal and most important, informal rules that govern relations among countries in the region. Bakit nga ba you have American military vessels and ships dyan sa West Philippine Sea, in South China Sea, and waters across the world? There are three reasons for that. First of all, the United States, especially since its victory in the Second World War, has been the global hegemon, meaning the predominant superpower. So more or less since the 1940s, patuloy yung military presence ng United States in this part of the world. Which brings me to the second important point. Kaya maraming American warships dyan is because they are conducting what is called freedom of navigation operations. If China is using its military muscle to intimidate smaller countries, the US has even a bigger muscle. And what the US does is that pinapasok nila yung kanilang warships dun sa mga territorial sea at malapit dun sa mga fake or artificial islands na ginawa ng China over disputed territories or land features dyan sa West Philippine Sea. Which brings me to the third point. In fact, the American military presence, yung deployment ng kanilang warships, more or less, this is also in consonance with international law. It's legitimate and legal. And this brings us to the concept of right of innocent passage. Now, if you look at Article 19, Paragraph 2 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, it's very clear that the US has a right to actually pass through international waters, the high seas dyan sa West Philippine Sea. And in fact, the US warships, as Chinese warships and other warships, pwede sila dumaan sa ating territorial sea so long as it's an innocent passage. Meaning, hindi nakatutok yung kanilang spying radar or yung kanilang weapons sa atin at dadaan sila ng derecho. In fact, China has been also doing that. They have been deploying their warships across the Philippines waters and sometimes even within our territorial sea. Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana made it clear that there were instances whereby Chinese warships were passing through our territorial sea, but they turned off their radar so we couldn't really detect what was happening. So it's quite hypocritical for China to question America's military presence, especially in the high seas, dyan sa West Philippines and South China Sea, while it itself has been deploying its warships within our territorial sea and that of other smaller countries in the region. So speaking of truth or lies, let's get those basic facts about history, about international law, right. Ako po si Richard Haydarian. Stand with us, stand for truth.